Can you relate with this? There's times that you just don't get it right. There's times I just mess up in my life. There are times that I'm very slow to learn. You probably would say it's because you're stubborn, right? Sometimes we have those stubborn tendencies. We don't want to take the lesson as it is. We have to learn the hard way. There's just times I'm totally disobedient to God. There's times I'm totally disobedient to God's will, maybe because I don't like it, maybe because it's going somewhere I do not want to go, or it does not seem as appealing as what I thought it would be. Then there's times that I'm just wore out mentally, physically, spiritually, the stress of life, the hurts, the emotional toll sometimes, the struggles that you go through all wear down on you. I often wonder, how on earth can God use me when I'm like this, as I'm with the ups and downs of life, the ebbs and flows and so forth? How on earth could God even use someone like me? And maybe you consider the same thing. But then I'm reminded of verses like these, as Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He began to refer to this thorn in the flesh, this weakness that he had. And he said in verse 9, God said unto him, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, and reproaches, and necessities, and persecutions, and distress for Christ's sake. And he says this, for when I am weak, then I am strong. And that's kind of the irony of the Christian life. Jesus said the least will be the greatest will be least, meaning there's a level playing field. We're going to struggle. We're going to have mess ups in life. And so as we talk about our episode today, we want to talk about this thought that God can still use our disobedience. So we step on the scene. We've been looking at the life of Jonah, who is a man of God. He's a God-called preacher. And as we stepped in on our episode on Tuesday, he's running from God. I mean, the exact opposite that you would expect for someone like Jonah. He's just fleeing, running from God. He's taking his next step in the wrong direction. And can I say, it's not just steps, but this dude is leaping. He is jumping. He is running as fast as he can. We find him there on a boat fleeing God's presence. Think about that. So here he has direct disobedience to God's clear, revealed will. Now, this may be a moment of weakness in Jonah's life, just like you and I have weaknesses. It could be a moment of just disobedience in Jonah's life that will get cleared up. You and I have those, but we definitely know it's a heart issue that Jonah had as he thought about what God was calling him to do and to whom he was calling him to do that. And so God was going to take the time to repair this issue. You know, it's amazing that even when we take steps in the wrong direction, God can still use our disobedience for his good. And it's so amazing that God is so patient with us. Let's read just a couple verses here in Jonah. Chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. Jonah is now trying to flee from the presence of the Lord. It says in verse 4, But the Lord sent out a great wind into the sea, and there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that the ship was like to be broken. Then the mariners were afraid, and cried every man unto his God, and cast forth the wares that were in the ship into the sea, to lighten it of them. But Jonah was gone down into the sides of the ship, and he lay and was fast asleep. It's amazing that he's down there just knocked out, snoozing. And all this is going on, a terrible storm, so much so that the captain and the people who were used to storms on the sea are fearing for their lives. They're calling out to their false gods. They're throwing their goods, their products, their possessions overboard just to keep the boat afloat. And here's Jonah being disobedient to God's will, down in the ship, fast asleep. So what do we learn from this issue here and how God can use our disobedience for his good? Well, first of all, Jonah's disobedience affected the lives of those around him. We need to be mindful of that. Our lives affect those around us. You know, our choices have consequences. Decisions have consequences, whether for the good or whether for the bad. And for here, we want to see his decisions were twofold. They were negative, but they were also positive, and we'll see that. So first, Jonah's disobedience affected the lives of those on this ship for the negative. You see, it was him and his decision to flee from God's presence that caused the storm. So in turn, it was Jonah's fault that these men were having to throw their possessions overboard. Now, it's more than likely that this ship had cargo. They were going to be paid, or they were being paid to carry it somewhere, or maybe they purchased the cargo and were going to sell it. So here is their livelihood, and they're literally having to toss it overboard just to destroy it, get rid of it. There's no opportunity for them to make the money. So this is a huge financial loss. This is a huge personal loss, and then it's going to affect the families of these men that are on board this ship. So this storm caused the negative as far as a financial loss, and it also caused the negative for them to fear for their lives. Imagine the stress, the emotional toll that they're going through because they are literally fearing for their lives. They don't know if the next wave is going to sink the ship. They don't know if the next clap of thunder and lightning is what's going to destroy their ship and thus their lives. They don't know at any moment if they're going to be swimming, hanging on to boards. That's what they're thinking. And so they're calling out to their gods, but their gods are not answering. You see, we do not live our lives just for ourselves. So many times we think that what I do, my life is all about me. But God is teaching us here that our lives are, our influence from our lives is much greater than you and I can even think and anticipate sometimes. We have such a tremendous impact on those around us. It's like ripple effect. If you've ever been at the pool or the beach or the lake, I love the lake when it's glass. It's smooth, there's not any wind, there's not any ripples on it, and you can throw a rock in. And what happens when that rock hits or that ball hits? Ripples come out. And they keep moving, and they keep moving further, further, further until they keep going all the way out. Waves from a boat that goes by are like those ripples. As the boat goes through, the waves continue on until finally they hit the shore or hit some other waves or so forth. And that's where our lives are. Our lives cause ripple effects that will affect many people. And sometimes the effects and the ripples will go further and intertwine with many people's lives that we will not even imagine that our decision could. And so our decisions can affect people for the negative, especially our disobedience, but also as we learn in this passage, which is very encouraging. I don't think it should encourage us to disobey God's will, but we do learn that God can use our disobedience for the positive. You wonder, how could anything good come out of Jonah's disobedience? Or how could anything good come out of you disobeying God's will and doing this or doing that? How could anything good come out of that? You see, Jonah was very honest with these men about what he was doing. We learned that because when they approach him and say, you've done this is your fault, you've run from your God, and this is why this storm has come. And it's interesting that he was that upfront with them. I'm running from God, I need to get on your ship, I'm going to pay you whatever the ticket cost is, and let's go. But we see here in verse number 13, it says, nevertheless, the men rowed hard to bring it to land, but they could not, for the sea wrought and was tempestuous against them. And so Jonah had said, look, you need to throw me overboard. That's what's going to stop the storm. But these men tried with everything in them to protect Jonah, and they tried. These were experienced people that were used to sailing, were used to storms, so they were prepared. They had the professional wisdom to take care of this, but they could not do anything about it. But it's interesting, they tried to save Jonah's life, and then we see in verse 14, wherefore they cried unto the Lord. Notice this is capital L, capital O-R-D. They cry out to him and say, we beseech thee, O Lord, we beseech thee, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not upon us innocent blood, for thou, O Lord, hast done as it pleased thee. And so they took up Jonah and cast him forth into the sea, and the sea ceased from her raging. And then verse 16, powerful verse. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and offered a sacrifice unto the Lord, and made vows. Think about that. So these men tried to save Jonah's life. They couldn't. And before, if we go back to verse number 5, they're calling upon their gods. Their gods are not answering, these false gods, these false idols. But because of Jonah's disobedience, these men come to a knowledge of Jehovah God. Think about this. They recognize him. They worship him. And so through Jonah's disobedience, he was supposed to go to Nineveh. That's the whole really gist, right? He's supposed to go to Nineveh. He runs. But here you have these men on this ship. And you know they weren't going to Nineveh because they're going in the opposite direction. So they weren't going to be landing in Nineveh with Jonah while he's preaching and the whole town of Nineveh gets saved and they're going to get saved. No, they were going in the opposite direction. And so God found them, and God used Jonah, even in his disobedience, to reach these men on the ship. So God uses our mess ups. God uses our failures. God uses our faults, and God can use your disobedience and my disobedience. Now, this encourages me. Definitely. It doesn't encourage me to have more faults and to have more failures and to disobey more. That's not the right concept here. But it does encourage me that God can use me in spite of me, in spite of my weaknesses. Because when I'm weak, Paul said, then I am strong. Why? Because that's when God can work through us, and it's not you and I, it's God. And so it challenges me to allow God to use me in a better way. A better way being in my obedience. You see, God is going to accomplish His will regardless of whether you and I obey or not. He has a will that He's going to accomplish. The question is, are you and I willing to get in with God on what He has going on? Are we willing to get in on what God is doing? Or are we willing to allow someone else to get in and experience that victory, experience that growth, experience that fruit? You see, God desires to use us and to allow us to enjoy in the fruit and the rewards of being used. So regardless, God is going to work. So are you being obedient to God's will right now in your life? Is there some aspect of His will that you're resisting, that you do not find appealing, so you're kind of delaying or you're going the opposite direction? Maybe you're just being completely disobedient. If you are in the middle of God's will and you are obeying it, stay at it. And let God use you in a mighty way. But if you're not, if you're resisting it, or if you're being disobedient, or you're going in the wrong direction, stop now. Confess it to God and begin following His will today.